Greetings. Just before we begin, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Are you tuning in from a quiet town in the UK, a bustling city in the US, or somewhere else in the world? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you won't miss any of these stories, delivered right to your screen. Now, take a moment to settle in. Close your eyes if you like, and begin to focus on your breathing. Breathe in slowly, hold it for a moment, and exhale gently. Feel the weight of your body sinking comfortably into your chair or bed as the busyness of your day begins to melt away. Picture yourself stepping back in time to a world dimly lit by flickering candles and hearth fires, where each day was a struggle to survive. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You can hear the faint murmur of a village settling into night, the crackle of flames dancing in stone hearths inside simple homes. As you breathe, imagine that rough texture of coarse fabrics, the cold stone walls, and the harsh reality of a life tied closely to the land, but also tightly bound by hardship. This was a world where women's lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, where strength was measured in endurance, and survival often demanded impossible choices. Stay with this feeling for a moment. Let your mind drift softly toward that time as together we explore the realities of medieval womanhood, a story not only of brutality, but also of remarkable resilience. In the quiet moments before dawn, imagine the world waking slowly under a slate-gray sky. Villages rise from mist, the scent of smoke curls from chimneys, and the soft clatter of wooden wheels on dirt roads stirs the air. This is medieval England, a world ruled by rhythms as old as time itself, where every day is shaped by boundaries, physical, social, and invisible. For women in this time, those boundaries were often walls, not just around homes, but around lives. Unlike today's world, where movement, choice, and voice feel like basic rights, medieval women lived in a landscape tightly fenced by tradition, law, and survival. Their bodies, their labor, their freedom, all defined by a society that measured a woman's worth in terms of obedience, fertility, and service. To understand why life was brutal for medieval women, we first need to step inside that world, to see how those limits shaped their every breath. The medieval village or town was the center of existence. It was where families worked, worshipped, married, and died. Homes were small, often 1 or 2 rooms, shared by extended kin. Privacy was scarce. Walls were thin. Doors never locked. Women's work began before dawn and stretched long into twilight. They fetched water from wells or streams, a daily journey that could take hours. They tended vegetable gardens, spun wool, baked bread, and cared for children. They milled grain, brewed ale, and cleaned every corner of the household. Their hands were never still, yet for all this toil, women had little control over the fruits of their labor. Property belonged to men, husbands, fathers, brothers. Inheritance laws favored sons. Widows might inherit in rare cases, but usually only as caretakers until a male heir came of age. Marriage was not just a social contract. It was often a legal and economic arrangement. Girls were married young, sometimes as early as 12 or 13, to strengthen family alliances or secure dowries. Love was a luxury few could afford. Consent was rarely discussed in terms we would recognize today. A wife's role was to bear children, especially sons, and manage the household. Failure to produce heirs could lead to scorn, neglect, or worse. And childbirth itself was perilous. Many women died in pregnancy or delivery, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Outside the home, women's legal status was limited, could rarely own land outright. They were often excluded from guilds and trades. Legal testimony from women was often discounted. Their voices were muted in courts and councils. Even the church, which offered some solace in community, reinforced restrictive gender roles. Preachers taught obedience to husbands. Women were reminded of Eve's original sin. The ideal was chastity, silence, and submission. Yet, despite these harsh confines, medieval women found ways to assert power, quietly, subtly, and sometimes boldly. Some ran households during their husbands' absences. Some managed businesses as widows. Others worked as midwives, healers, or market traders, roles that gave them some economic agency. But such autonomy was fragile, always under threat from social norms and laws designed to keep women in their place. Life was brutal, not just because of physical hardship, but because of constant vulnerability. A woman could be accused of witchcraft for speaking out of turn. She could be abandoned or beaten for defying her husband. She could lose custody of children if widowed. Her reputation could be ruined by gossip, with devastating social consequences. And this vulnerability was enforced by community surveillance. Neighbors watched closely. Church elders judged openly. Family honor was a fragile thing, guarded fiercely. In such a world, survival required strength, resilience, and often silence. But to paint medieval women only as victims is incomplete. Within this harshness lived stories of courage, community, and resistance. Women forged bonds across households. They shared knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and healing. They organized networks of support in times of famine, war, and plague. Through oral traditions, folk songs, and whispered prayers, they preserved culture and memory. And sometimes, in moments of crisis, they pushed back in courtrooms, markets, or even on battlefields. This complex reality, a world where brutality and resilience intertwined, shaped the course of history and the lives of countless women whose names are lost but whose spirits endure. Marriage in medieval times was far more than a union of two people. It was the central institution around which a woman's life revolved, a complex network of social expectations, economic realities, and family politics. Understanding medieval marriage is essential to grasp why life was often brutal for women. During this period, in many ways, marriage was a contract, not of love, but of duty. Girls were often promised in marriage from a young age. Arranged matches were common, designed to strengthen alliances between families, consolidate land or wealth, or ensure social stability. It was rare that a young woman chose her own husband freely. Love, as a concept we cherish today, was often secondary, even irrelevant. The typical age for a bride was between 12 and 16 years, though some girls married earlier, especially among the nobility, where political considerations were paramount. Young women were often still children themselves, yet expected to take on the responsibilities of a wife, household manager, and mother immediately. A medieval marriage carried immense weight. For a woman, it was not only about personal survival, but about securing her family's future and honor. A successful marriage meant children, especially sons, to inherit property and carry the family name. A failed marriage could mean social ruin, economic hardship, and sometimes abandonment. The daily life of a married woman was strenuous and tightly controlled. She was expected to run the household, which was no small feat. From managing servants or helping with farm labor to spinning wool and preparing meals, the wife's hands were never idle. Mistakes or neglect could bring harsh consequences, both from her husband and the wider community. But the harshest demands came from the high expectation of childbirth. That medieval women often endured repeated pregnancies and dangerous deliveries. With limited medical knowledge, childbirth was a leading cause of death among women. The pain, risks, and emotional toll were enormous. Yet there was little choice but to bear child after child. Surviving infants was another challenge. High infant mortality rates meant that many mothers lost children early, only to become pregnant again soon after. This cycle of birth and loss shaped women's lives profoundly, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Marriage also limited a woman's legal independence. In most cases, a husband gained control over his wife's property and earnings, a concept called coverture. Legally, a wife's identity was subsumed under her husband's. She could not sign contracts, represent herself in court, or own land separately without his consent. If widowed, a woman might gain some legal rights, but even then, her position was precarious. Guardianship of children typically passed to male relatives. Widows could be pressured to remarry quickly to preserve family alliances and property. Inheritance laws favored male heirs, leaving many women economically vulnerable. Domestic violence was a grim reality. While the church preached marital obedience, it also condemned cruelty. However, enforcement was inconsistent. A husband's authority often included corporal punishment of his wife, justified as discipline. Women had limited recourse against abuse. Social stigma and economic dependence often forced them to endure hardship silently. This environment fostered fear, anxiety, and the need for careful navigation of family dynamics. Yet, women were not merely passive victims. Marriage could also be a source of influence and power, particularly among the nobility. Queens and noble women acted as political actors behind the scenes, managing estates, arranging alliances, and occasionally ruling in the absence of husbands or sons. Even common women could exercise agency within their households, making decisions about domestic management, child rearing, and community relations. Widows, especially, could command respect and autonomy not afforded to married women. Beyond the household, women formed social networks with other women, shared experiences in marriage, childbirth, and household duties created bonds of support and knowledge exchange. These networks often operated through informal gatherings, church groups, and markets, spaces where women could advise each other on everything from herbal remedies to dispute resolution. Religion shaped women's experience of marriage deeply. The church taught that marriage was sacred and indissoluble. Divorce was nearly impossible, though annulments could be granted under specific conditions. The ideal wife was patient, obedient, and chaste. Failing in these virtues risked moral condemnation and social punishment. However, the church also provided women with spiritual resources to cope with suffering, offering hope of salvation and eternal reward. Understanding medieval marriage reveals why women's lives were often bound by contracts not of their making, carrying heavy physical and emotional burdens, and constrained legally and socially. Marriage could feel like both a prison and a lifeline. But even within these strictures, women found ways to survive, influence, and sometimes resist. In the world of medieval England, the sun didn't simply rise and set on fields and forests. It rose and set on the endless work that kept families, villages, and towns alive. And while history often highlights the deeds of kings, knights, and nobles, the true engine of medieval life was the labor of women, the invisible backbone holding the world together. Yet, paradoxically, the harder they worked, the less recognition they received. To understand the brutality of medieval life for women, we must first understand their work, relentless, diverse, and deeply essential, but often unseen or undervalued. The household, center of work and responsibility for most medieval women, home was both sanctuary and workplace. The household was a hive of activity from dawn to dusk, where a woman's labor shaped the very survival of her family. This was no small task. Cooking was laborious. No gas stoves or microwaves. Only open hearths where fires needed tending constantly. Bread baking required grinding grain by hand, preparing dough, and managing the heat of stone ovens. Preserving food through salting, drying, or smoking was a skill passed down through generations. Water, the lifeblood of all these tasks, rarely came running from a tap. Women carried heavy buckets from wells or rivers, sometimes walking miles each day. Cleaning was constant, sweeping floors, washing linens by hand, caring for animals inside or near the home, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, sewing, and mending garments consumed many hours. Every patch, every stitch was vital. Clothes were precious and expensive. In wealthy households, women supervised servants and managed resources. In poorer homes, they performed every task themselves, often while caring for children or elderly relatives. Agricultural labor outside the home, many women worked in the fields, especially in rural areas. Medieval farming was backbreaking and seasonal. Women planted, weeded, harvested, and stored crops. They cared for livestock, milking cows and goats, feeding animals, cleaning stables. Tasks varied with the seasons. Spring and summer meant planting and tending. Autumn was the harvest, a frantic time demanding long days. Winter brought preservation and repair work. Though men often handled the plow, women's labor was indispensable. In many cases, women worked alongside their husbands, brothers, and sons, sometimes for wages, sometimes as unpaid family workers. Craft and trade in towns and cities. Women were active in trades and crafts, though often unofficially. Some were members of guilds, especially widows who inherited their husbands' businesses. Others worked as apprentices, spinners, weavers, or shopkeepers. Marketplaces were a common arena for women, selling food, textiles, herbs, and household goods. Yet, despite their contributions, many trades barred women officially. Guilds often restricted membership to men, limiting women's opportunities for economic independence. Still, women found ways to work, informally or behind the scenes, shaping local economies in subtle but vital ways. Midwives, healers, and wise women. One of the few respected female roles was that of the midwife. Given the dangers of childbirth, midwives played a critical role in communities. They assisted births, provided care for mothers and infants, and offered advice on health and hygiene. Beyond midwifery, many women acted as herbalists, healers, or wise women, using knowledge of plants and remedies passed down through oral tradition. Though sometimes viewed with suspicion and occasionally accused of witchcraft, these women were essential caregivers and custodians of folk medicine. Their work saved lives, eased suffering, and connected generations. The burden of unpaid labor, despite the vastness of their work, medieval women rarely received financial reward or public recognition. Most domestic and agricultural labor was unpaid, considered part of a wife's duty rather than an economic contribution. This invisibility in records and legal documents has led to centuries of misunderstanding women's true role in medieval society. Women's labor was often taken for granted, essential but unseen, a shadow economy holding everything together. The physical toll, relentless work, took a severe physical toll. Women labored from childhood to old age. Pregnancy and childbirth added weight to their burden. Nutrition was often poor, and medical care limited. Archaeological studies of medieval women's skeletons reveal wear consistent with heavy manual labor, joint degeneration, healed fractures, and signs of repetitive strain. These women endured pain and exhaustion with little relief. Emotional labor and social expectations work wasn't just physical. It was emotional and social. Women were expected to maintain family harmony, raise children properly, and uphold social norms. They bore the responsibility for education at home, teaching manners, faith, and skills. Failing in these duties could bring shame or punishment. Their emotional labor, soothing, caregiving, mediating, was constant and largely unacknowledged. Resistance and resilience yet. Within this brutal world, women displayed remarkable resilience. They formed support networks, sharing advice, resources, and comfort. Some negotiated with landlords or local officials. Others petitioned courts for justice or protection. Stories survive of women who managed estates, led communities, or influenced politics through counsel or patronage. Their strength often lay in endurance, adaptability, and solidarity. Understanding. Medieval women's work reveals why life was so harsh, but it also reveals their power to shape the world quietly, insistently, and endurily. In the medieval world, life was bound by laws, not just those carved in stone or written on parchment, but those spoken softly in homes and churches, whispered through village streets, and enforced by the heavy hand of tradition. For women, these laws and customs created a strict framework that shaped not only what they could do, but who they were allowed to be. The medieval legal system was a complex weave of royal edicts, local customs, and church doctrine, all intersecting in ways that placed women in a difficult and often vulnerable position. Understanding these controls is vital to seeing why life was so brutal for medieval women, because control over their bodies, their actions, and their voices was central to the social order. Marriage and property laws, coverture and control. One of the most defining legal principles affecting women was the doctrine of coverture. Under this system, when a woman married, her legal identity was subsumed under her husband's. She could not own property independently, enter contracts, or sue and be sued in court without her husband's involvement. This loss of legal autonomy meant that a woman's fate was tightly bound to her husband's will and fortunes. DOWRIES and jointure. Agreements might provide some financial security, but women rarely controlled their own wealth. If a marriage ended through death or separation, a widow's rights were often precarious. Widows could inherit and manage property, but faced pressure to remarry quickly, ensuring property stayed within male control. Custody and children. In matters of children, medieval law generally favored fathers. If a woman was widowed or separated, custody of sons, the primary heirs, usually passed to male relatives or guardians appointed by courts. Mothers might retain custody of daughters, but this varied by region and circumstance. Women's rights over their children were limited, and disputes often left them vulnerable to losing contact. Sexuality and moral surveillance. Medieval society was intensely concerned with women's sexuality, not just for religious reasons, but for social and economic ones. Virginity before marriage was prized, linked to family honor and legitimacy of heirs. Church courts policed sexual behavior strictly. Adultery, fornication, and promiscuity were sins and crimes, punished by penance, fines, or even public humiliation. Accusations of sexual misconduct could ruin a woman's reputation permanently, often based on gossip or flimsy evidence. Witchcraft and social control. The fear of witchcraft added another layer of control over women's bodies and minds, especially from the 15th century onwards. Women, particularly those who were older, widowed, or marginalized, were accused of witchcraft and subjected to trials, torture, and execution. While the peak of witch hunts came later, the medieval church's teachings about women's susceptibility to sin and the devil contributed to a climate of suspicion and control. Dress and behavioral code. Sumptuary laws regulated what people could wear based on class and status, including strict rules about women's clothing. These laws reinforced social hierarchies and controlled women's appearance as a marker of virtue or status. Modesty was enforced through dress codes, while behavior was monitored by communities and church officials. Women were expected to be silent, obedient, and chaste, with deviation risking punishment. Legal punishments and remedies. Women accused of crimes faced harsh punishments: public whipping, imprisonment, or banishment. However, legal remedies for women were limited, and access to justice was often mediated by male relatives or patrons. Women of higher status might navigate the courts more effectively, but common women often relied on local customs and informal negotiation, resistance and negotiation within the law. Despite these restrictions, women sometimes used the law to their advantage. Widows could inherit property and manage estates. Some women petitioned courts for separation or protection from abusive husbands. Guilds occasionally admitted women, and some women ran businesses as widows or through male proxies. Literary records show women engaging in legal disputes over dowries, debts, and inheritance. This negotiation shows women were not entirely powerless, but constantly maneuvering within a system designed to limit them. The church's role. The church was both a place of refuge and a source of control. Nuns and abbesses held authority within convents, but outside, the church reinforced patriarchal norms. Confession and penance regulated women's morality, while sermons taught submission. Still, the church offered education to some women and provided a spiritual framework that could empower inner strength. The physical and psychological impact. The social and legal controls had deep effects on women's physical and mental well-being. Limited freedom, constant surveillance, and threats of violence created stress and fear. Many women lived with the tension between obedience and desire for autonomy, a conflict reflected in medieval literature and folklore. Conclusion. Medieval laws and social customs tightly controlled women's lives, their bodies, choices, and voices. These constraints were enforced through legal doctrine, community norms, and religious teachings. Yet, within these confines, women found ways to survive, resist, and assert their presence, often quietly, often at great personal cost. Understanding this legal and social framework is crucial to grasping the brutality of medieval womanhood, a life marked by endurance in the face of relentless limits. In the tapestry of medieval life, religion was a thread so tightly woven that it shaped nearly every moment, from birth to death, from joy to suffering. For medieval women, the church was both a source of hope and a keeper of rules, offering sanctuary yet enforcing control. To understand why life was brutal for medieval women, we must look at the powerful role faith played in defining their existence. Medieval church was the center of community life. It dictated moral codes, social behavior, and even legal matters. Church teachings emphasized the ideal of womanhood, purity, obedience, humility. Women were often portrayed as vessels of sin and redemption, inheritors of Eve's original fault, tasked with nurturing faith and family. Religious duties and daily life. Women attended Mass regularly, observed fasts, and participated in feast days. These punctuated the calendar with rituals that structured time. They prayed for the souls of their families, sought the intercession of saints, and engaged in personal devotions. The church also provided opportunities for women as nuns, who could lead cloistered lives dedicated to prayer, education, and service. While convent life was a refuge for some, it was also a strict, enclosed existence bound by vows and obedience, spiritual expectations, and gender. Church's teachings reinforced the idea that women's primary spiritual role was obedience to male authority, first to God, then to husband, father, or guardian. Women were encouraged to accept suffering as part of their earthly journey and to seek salvation through humility. Preachers often warned against women's vanity, pride, and desire, reinforcing social controls. Through theology, mystics, and female saints, despite these restrictions, some medieval women emerged as powerful spiritual figures. Mystics like Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen experienced visions and wrote theological works that influenced religious thought. Saints such as Joan of Arc challenged gender norms through faith and action. These exceptional women provided alternative models of female spirituality, sources of inspiration, and sometimes controversy. Church courts and moral. Policing church courts had jurisdiction over many aspects of life, including marriage, sexual behavior, and moral conduct. Women accused of transgressions faced trials and penance, often harsher than for men. The church's power to discipline women's bodies and behavior added to the pressures they faced daily. Religious festivals and community. On a lighter note, religious festivals provided rare moments of communal joy. And celebration. Women took part in processions, feasts, and dances, occasions where social hierarchies sometimes relaxed and community bonds were strengthened. These events, though infrequent, offered respite from daily hardships. Faith as comfort and resistance. For many women, faith was a source of comfort amid suffering. Prayer, pilgrimage, and participation in religious life gave meaning and hope. At times, religious devotion was a form of subtle resistance, a way to claim dignity and agency within restrictive structures. The medieval church was thus both a fortress and a cage for women, sheltering souls but shaping bodies and minds to fit a rigid ideal. Understanding this duality reveals another layer of why life was so brutal for medieval women. Caught between spiritual aspiration and earthly limitation. In medieval times, the line between life and death was razor thin, especially for women. From their earliest days, women faced dangers that modern medicine has long since reduced or eliminated, but which then loomed large and often deadly. Understanding the harsh realities of medieval medicine and childbirth sheds profound light on why women's lives were so precarious and, yes, brutal. Medical knowledge and its limits. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a patchwork of classical texts, religious beliefs, folk remedies, and superstition. Hospitals were scarce and usually connected to monasteries or the church, serving mainly the poor and pilgrims. Doctors and surgeons were few, and their understanding of the human body was limited, largely based on Galen's ancient texts and the theory of humors. For women, knowledge about female health was even more restricted, shaped by cultural taboos and male-dominated medical practice. Midwives, guardians of life. Despite the gaps in formal medicine, women often turned to midwives and female healers for care. Midwives held a crucial role in childbirth, guiding women through the labor process with experience passed down over generations. They also treated women's ailments, helped with contraception, and cared for newborns. However, midwives worked under suspicion, especially if a birth went wrong or if they used herbal remedies perceived as dangerous or linked to witchcraft. The ordeal of childbirth was a terrifying ordeal. Many women gave birth multiple times, often with little rest between pregnancies. Complications such as obstructed labor, infections, hemorrhaging, or stillbirth were common and frequently fatal. Without effective pain relief or sterile conditions, every birth risked becoming a crisis. Maternal mortality rates were high. Some estimates suggest that 1 in 5 women died from childbirth-related causes. Infant mortality was even worse, with many children not surviving their first year. Women's bodies under surveillance. Medieval society closely monitored women's bodies. Virginity, menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth were laden with moral and social significance. Menstruation was often misunderstood and feared, sometimes viewed as unclean. Pregnancy outside marriage was a scandal punishable by law. Abortions and contraception, while practiced through herbal means, were dangerous and heavily tabooed. Healing practices and folk remedies. Women frequently relied on herbal remedies, poultices, and charms to treat common ailments. Knowledge of plants like willow, a natural painkiller, or rosemary, for memory. Circulation was vital. Women shared this wisdom in households and communities. Though some of these remedies were effective, others were based on superstition and could be harmful. Pain, suffering, And spirituality pain was an expected part of life and childbirth, especially was tied to spiritual beliefs. Many women accepted suffering as a form of penance, linking their pain to salvation. Religious rituals, prayers, and relics were often part of healing practices. This spiritual framework offered comfort, but also reinforced acceptance of hardship. Resilience amid fragility. Despite the dangers, women showed remarkable resilience, surviving childbirth, managing household health crises, and caring for sick family members were daily realities. Women's strength was physical, emotional, and spiritual. Their knowledge, though informal, was essential to community health. The legacy of medical struggle, the harsh realities of medieval women's health, shaped not only their lives, but the social fabric. Their vulnerability made control over women's bodies a matter of societal concern, reinforcing laws and customs around sexuality, marriage, and morality. Yet, their endurance laid the foundation for future advances in women's medicine and health rights. In a world where harsh laws, physical toil, and social restrictions pressed heavily on medieval women, one vital source of strength and survival was their social networks, the friendships, bonds, and communities they formed with one another. Life could be brutal, but it was rarely endured alone. To truly understand medieval womanhood, its pain, resilience, and quiet defiance, we must look beyond laws and labor and into the spaces where women gathered, supported, and shared their lives. The village and town as social webs. Medieval villages and towns were small but complex social environments. Every household was linked to others through kinship, work, faith, and necessity. Women's lives were interwoven with those of mothers, sisters, aunts, neighbors, and fellow market sellers. These connections weren't just casual acquaintances. They were essential lifelines for survival, advice, companionship, and sometimes resistance. Neighborhood bonds and daily encounters. Most women knew their neighbors intimately. They exchanged news, shared food during scarcity, and helped with childcare. If a family faced illness or death, neighbors might come to aid, cooking meals, minding children, or tending animals. These daily acts created webs of mutual reliance. Yet, alongside support, gossip and social policing thrived. Women's behavior was constantly observed and judged by those around them, reinforcing social norms, but also offering subtle power to those adept at navigating the community's expectations. Female friendships and confidants within these networks. Close female friendships provided emotional sanctuary. Women confided in each other about fears, hopes, and frustrations often unspoken elsewhere. They shared stories of childbirth, marriages, and grief. These relationships could span decades and generations, a source of comfort amid a harsh world. Gatherings and celebration. Social life included gatherings, formal and informal, feasts and festivals tied to the church. Calendar were key moments for community bonding. Women participated in processions, dances, and communal meals. Even workdays had moments of shared laughter during harvests or spinning bees, where women gathered to work together, exchange news, and weave both wool and social ties. The role of the church and religious communities. Church life provided women a larger social framework. Parish gatherings, women's guilds, and confraternities offered spiritual and practical support. These groups organized charitable works, supported widows, and facilitated communal worship. For many women, the church was both a place of solace and a venue for social engagement. Marketplaces, hubs of female interaction markets, were bustling centers where women not only sold goods, but also exchanged information and built networks. Market days brought together women from surrounding villages and towns, expanding their social circles. The marketplace was a place of economic opportunity, but also social negotiation and alliance building. Midwives and healers as social connectors. Midwives, herbalists, and healers held unique social roles, beyond their medical functions. They were often the keepers of oral histories and traditions. Women sought them for counsel, creating bonds of trust and reliance. These relationships extended beyond health, touching on community identity and resilience. Women's workspaces and solidarity. Many forms of work, spinning, weaving, brewing, were communal. Workshops and homes became spaces of shared labor and socialization. Solidarity among working women helped protect them from exploitation and fostered shared knowledge. Guilds sometimes admitted women, especially widows, enabling collective support. Resistance and negotiation through social networks provided means of subtle resistance. Women could band together to challenge unfair treatment by landlords or officials. Collective action in markets or villages sometimes pressured authorities or settled disputes. These networks were vital in negotiating power in a male-dominated society. Letters and written communication, though literacy rates were low. Some women learned to read and write. Letters between women reveal expressions of affection, support, and information sharing. These written networks preserved relationships across distances and time. The power and limits of female community, while female networks provided crucial support. They also operated within a society that limited women's freedom. Social expectations constrained behavior, and women sometimes policed one another to maintain order. Conflicts and rivalries existed alongside solidarity. Conclusion: the social fabric as survival. The bonds and networks medieval women wove were lifelines in a brutal world. Through friendship, shared labor, and communal rituals, they built resilience and found moments of joy. Their social lives were acts of survival, weaving a fabric strong enough to hold them through hardship. In the quiet of a medieval village or the bustling streets of a town, danger often lingered, unseen, woven into the fabric of daily life, especially for women. Though they formed strong social bonds and weathered harsh conditions with resilience, medieval women also faced threats that made their existence precarious. Even brutal. Violence and vulnerability were grim realities, born not just from external forces like war or crime, but also from intimate relationships and societal structures designed to control and silence. To truly understand the harshness of medieval womanhood, we must confront the many forms of violence that stalk their lives. Domestic violence, the private threat. One of the most persistent dangers for medieval women was violence within the home. Marriage, which bound women legally and socially, could also be a site of cruelty and abuse. Corporal punishment by husbands was often justified as discipline, and though the church condemned excessive violence, enforcement was inconsistent. Women had limited legal protection, and social expectations demanded silence and submission. Victims faced shame, isolation, and economic dependence that made leaving dangerous or impossible. Sexual violence and social stigma. Sexual violence was another harsh reality, rarely discussed openly, and often concealed by stigma. Women were vulnerable to assault from strangers and acquaintances alike. Accusations of rape were difficult to prove and carried risks for the victim's reputation. The social blame often fell on women, who faced skepticism or punishment, public violence, and legal punishments. Beyond the home, women could be caught in the crossfire of broader violence. Wars, raids, and local conflicts disrupted communities. Women were sometimes targeted or displaced. Additionally, women accused of crimes faced harsh punishments: whipping, imprisonment, or execution, often meted out with gendered cruelty. Witch hunts and the fear of female power. From the late medieval period onward, fears of witchcraft intensified. Older, poor, or socially marginalized women were often scapegoated. Trials and executions for witchcraft were brutal and traumatizing, driven by superstition, fear, and misogyny. This added a layer of terror to many women's lives. Legal and illegal. Social controls as violence, the very laws and customs that govern women's lives, can be seen as a form of structural violence. Restrictions on property, speech, and movement limited autonomy. Social policing through gossip and religious doctrine enforced conformity. Women's bodies and choices were tightly regulated, often with severe consequences for transgression. Psychological toll living under. Constant threat and control took a profound emotional and psychological toll. Anxiety, depression, and despair were common, though rarely recorded in historical documents. Women's resilience was remarkable, but came at great cost. Survival strategies. Despite dangers, women employed various strategies to protect themselves. Alliances with kin and neighbors, negotiating with abusive spouses, appealing to church authorities, and relying on community support were common. Some women used religious faith as refuge and strength. Violence and resistance in literature and records. Medieval texts and court records reveal glimpses of violence and women's responses, from pleas for justice to stories of escape and defiance. Women's voices, though often muffled, persist. These sources offer invaluable insight into their lived experiences. The harsh reality. For many medieval women, violence was not an isolated event, but a chronic part of life. This reality shaped their worldviews, choices, and survival. Understanding this aspect is crucial to grasping why life was so brutal for them. Conclusion. Violence and vulnerability were woven into the fabric of medieval womanhood, a shadow that complicated every joy and struggle. Yet, within these shadows, women found ways to endure, resist, and even transform their circumstances. Their stories of pain and strength remind us that brutality was never the whole story, but it was a defining one. Amid the shadows of oppression, labor, and danger, a few medieval women emerged whose lives dared to challenge the strict limits imposed by their time. They navigated a world that sought to confine them, and, through courage, wit, or circumstance, left marks that history has remembered, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly. Understanding these women is crucial, for they reveal not only the brutal realities, but also the sparks of resistance, agency, and power medieval women could wield. Noble women and political power. Noble women often had access to influence denied to others. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine wielded political power across kingdoms, acting as regents, patrons, and diplomats. Margaret of Anjou played a crucial role during the Wars of the Roses, navigating alliances and armies. These women managed estates, led troops, and negotiated treaties, often in a world dominated by men, while their privilege shielded them somewhat from daily brutality. Their lives were no less perilous, filled with political intrigue and threats. Religious women with authority. In convents and abbeys, some women gained religious and economic authority. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen commanded respect, led communities, and contributed to theology, science, and music. These spiritual leaders carved out spaces of female autonomy, intellectual engagement, and leadership rare in medieval society. Women writers and thinkers. Despite limited access to education, some women expressed themselves through writing. Christine de Pizan, often considered Europe's first professional female writer, penned works defending women's worth and intellect. Her books challenged misogynistic attitudes and offered an alternative vision of female dignity. Other women wrote letters, poetry, and devotional texts, preserving voices that might otherwise have been lost. Artisans and businesswomen. Some women achieved economic independence as artisans or merchants. Widows could inherit businesses and guild memberships, running shops, workshops, or farms. Constrained by law and custom, these women negotiated contracts, managed employees, and controlled wealth. Their stories reveal the complexities of medieval economic life for women, peasant women, and everyday resistance. Not all resistance came from privilege. Peasant women used subtle means to assert agency, negotiating labor demands, managing household economies, or covertly challenging authority. Folk tales and court records show women defending their rights, complaining about unfair treatment, and sometimes participating in local rebellions. Women in warfare, though uncommon. Some women took part directly or indirectly in warfare. Figures like Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, became icons of female martial leadership. Others supported armies through nursing, provisioning, or even fighting disguised as men. These stories challenged contemporary ideas about gender and capability. Defying social norms, some women lived outside prescribed roles as hermits, healers, or rebels. Their lives often courted danger from church or civil authorities, but embodied personal courage and conviction. Their stories reveal alternative models of medieval womanhood beyond obedience and submission. The cost of defiance resistance often came at high price. Women who challenged norms faced imprisonment, exile, or execution. Their legacies survived partly through records that condemned or celebrated their actions. Legacy and memory. Though few women's names were recorded, their impact shaped medieval society's evolution. They inspired future generations, challenged assumptions, and broadened the scope of female possibility. Conclusion: medieval women's lives were marked by brutality, but also by resilience and defiance. From queens to peasants, from saints to rebels, their stories form a mosaic of courage amid constraint. These women remind us that even in the harshest conditions, agency can endure and transform. Though the daily lives of medieval women were often marked by hardship and constraint, their influence resonates through history, not only in formal records, but in the rich tapestry of culture they helped weave. From folklore and literature to traditions and community practices, medieval women left legacies that shaped societies far beyond their time. Understanding these cultural legacies reveals a side of medieval womanhood often overlooked: their creativity, wisdom, and enduring impact. Folklore and oral traditions. Medieval women were vital carriers of folklore stories, songs, and oral histories passed through generations. In a largely illiterate society, oral storytelling was key to preserving collective memory and social values. Women's tales included cautionary legends, fairy tales, moral fables, and heroic epics, often featuring female protagonists or wise women. These stories provided both entertainment and instruction, reflecting communal hopes, fears, and ideals. Women in literature and poetry. While male authors dominated medieval literature, women's voices appeared in poetry, romances, and religious texts. Mystical writings by women like Julian of Norwich introduced profound spiritual insights. Courtly love poetry occasionally featured female perspectives, challenging norms of gender and desire. Some women composed songs or manuscripts that circulated among aristocratic circles, influencing literary, culture, religious traditions, and festivals. Women shaped religious practices through participation in rituals, pilgrimages, and saint veneration. Certain festivals highlighted female saints and Marian devotions, offering women spiritual agency and communal roles. Women's guilds and confraternities organized charity and worship, intertwining faith with social cohesion. Domestic arts and craft skills in spinning, weaving, embroidery, and cooking were transmitted mainly by women, forming a core of cultural heritage. These arts not only sustained households, but expressed identity, creativity, and status. Intricate embroidery or weaving patterns carried symbolic meaning and local tradition. Healing and herbal knowledge. Women's roles as healers embedded them deeply in cultural practices of medicine and wellness. Herbal remedies, charms, and midwifery techniques passed through generations. Often blending Christian and pagan elements, this knowledge shaped community, health, and spiritual belief systems. Legal and social customs. Women influenced social customs surrounding marriage, birth, and death ceremonies rich with symbolism and communal participation. Customs of dowry, mourning, and naming shaped family and community identities. Through these rituals, women preserved and transmitted cultural values, resistance in cultural expressions. Some women used cultural forms to resist oppression. Ballads and songs could encode political critique or personal grief. Storytelling, sometimes subtly questioned. Dominant gender norms. These expressions offered emotional release and community. Solidarity. Legacy in modern culture. Many medieval women's cultural contributions survive indirectly. Fairy tales collected centuries later trace roots to medieval. Oral traditions. Folk medicine inspires modern herbalism. Religious festivals retain echoes of medieval women's devotion, and literature continues to rediscover women's voices from the past. Conclusion. Though often hidden beneath the hardships of their lives, medieval women's cultural legacies endure as testimony to their resilience, creativity, and humanity. Their stories, songs, and traditions form a bridge between past and present, inviting us to remember not only the brutality they endured, but the rich lives they lived. As the medieval era waned and the early modern period dawned, the lives of women began to change, slowly, unevenly, and often painfully. The brutality of the Middle Ages did not disappear overnight, nor did the strict social and legal constraints that had shaped women's existence. Yet the seeds of transformation were planted, nurtured by economic shifts, cultural upheavals, and the relentless human desire for autonomy and dignity. By examining the evolution from medieval womanhood into the early modern period and beyond, we can better understand the long arc of women's struggle for survival, voice, and respect. Economic and social shifts. The late medieval period saw significant economic changes. The Black Death reduced populations drastically, shifting labor demands and weakening feudal structures. This labor shortage gave some women new opportunities to work for wages, inherit property, and negotiate better terms. Towns grew, markets expanded, and trade networks reached further than ever before. Women increasingly participated in urban economies as shopkeepers, artisans, and traders. Still, these gains were fragile, often contested by men and institutions clinging to old hierarchies. Legal reforms and persistent constraints. Legal systems slowly evolved, sometimes granting women more rights, such as the ability to own property independently, make wills, or conduct business. Widows especially gained relative autonomy in many regions. However, patriarchal control remained pervasive. Marriage laws continued to prioritize male authority, and women's legal personhood was often limited. Religious and social doctrines reinforced gender roles, maintaining pressures for conformity and submission. Cultural and intellectual developments. The Renaissance sparked new ideas about human potential, education, and the arts. Some women, daughters of nobles and merchants, accessed education and engaged in literary, artistic, and philosophical pursuits. Figures like Elizabeth I, Mary Wollstonecraft, and later Mary Shelley emerged from this evolving context. Still, widespread educational opportunities for women remained rare for centuries. Religious reformations. And women. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation transformed religious life across Europe. For women, these changes brought both challenges and new roles. Protestant emphasis on personal Bible reading encouraged literacy among women. Convents closed in many areas, reducing options for women seeking religious life. Yet laywomen found new spaces for spiritual engagement in emerging Protestant communities. The birth of feminist thought, early feminist ideas, began to surface in writings advocating women's education, legal rights, and social equality. Works like Mary Astle's A Serious Proposal to the Ladies challenged traditional views. These voices planted intellectual seeds that would grow over the coming centuries. Continuities of struggle despite advances. Many brutal realities persisted. Violence against women, social restrictions, and economic dependence remained widespread. Women continued to navigate oppressive structures while seeking spaces for agency. Legacy and lessons. The evolution from medieval times onward reveals a complex picture of slow progress entwined with enduring hardship. It underscores the resilience and creativity of women who lived through harsh conditions and helped shape new possibilities. Connecting past and present. Understanding medieval women's lives enriches modern conversations about gender, power, and justice. It reminds us how far we have come and how much courage and persistence change demands. Conclusion. The journey of women from the medieval era into the modern world is a testament to human endurance. Their stories, struggles, and small victories continue to inspire and challenge us today. As the 15th century gave way to the dawn of the early modern era, the fabric of medieval society began to shift. Old customs, laws, and power structures that had long bound women in roles of submission and hardship started to fray, sometimes barely, sometimes with dramatic force. This was not an overnight revolution, but a slow, uneven unraveling of medieval womanhood's harshest threads, driven by economic change, religious upheaval, and the stirrings of new ideas. Economic transformation and women's roles. The devastation wrought by the Black Death reshaped Europe's labor landscape. With so many lives lost, labor became a precious commodity. Survivors, including women, found themselves in a position to demand better conditions and wages. In towns and cities, women's participation in trade and crafts increased, albeit often informally or through widowhood. Guilds began, in some cases, to admit women as members, or at least to allow them to carry on a deceased husband's business. Markets bustled with women selling textiles, foodstuffs, and household goods. Their economic presence vital to urban life. However, this growth was fragile. Social and legal backlash sought to reinscribe male control, religious changes, and female agency. The Reformation challenged the Catholic Church's monopoly on spiritual life, introducing new ideas about personal faith and scripture. Women's access to the Bible in vernacular languages encouraged literacy among some. Protestant communities often created spaces for women's religious expression, though still within patriarchal limits. Simultaneously, the closure of convents removed one refuge for women seeking spiritual and social autonomy. Education and intellectual awakening. The Renaissance ideal of the educated individual began to influence women's lives, primarily among elites, princesses, noblewomen, and some middle-class women learned Latin, philosophy, and the arts. Figures like Margaret Roper, daughter of Thomas More, exemplified learned women engaging in public discourse. Still, education for most women remained limited, but these early pioneers laid groundwork for later movements. Legal reforms and persisting restrictions. Legal codes evolved, sometimes granting women more rights to property, inheritance, and legal recourse. Widows especially gained greater autonomy. However, patriarchal assumptions persisted strongly in marriage laws, family law, and social expectations. Women's legal personhood remained incomplete. The rise of feminist voices. Seeds of feminist thought appeared with writers advocating for women's education and rights. Though rare and often suppressed, these ideas began to challenge centuries of silence. Mary Astale, later in the 17th century, would be among the first to articulate feminist arguments in print, continuing hardships and violence. Despite progress, violence against women, domestic abuse, sexual violence, Witch hunts continued. Women still faced social control, surveillance, and limited freedom. Survival remained a daily challenge. Legacy of the medieval woman, the slow unraveling of medieval. Womanhood's brutal realities was neither linear nor complete in this period. Yet, the era marks a vital bridge from past to future, carrying lessons of resilience and resistance. Preparing for the future, understanding these transitional centuries, helps us appreciate the ongoing struggles and triumphs in women's history. Brutality was not an endpoint, but part of a long story, one that continues to unfold in a world largely ruled by tradition and rigid social structures. Knowledge was power, but it was a power unevenly distributed. For medieval women, access to education and literacy was limited, closely tied to class, religion, and geography. Yet despite numerous barriers, many women found ways to learn, teach, and preserve knowledge, often quietly shaping their own worlds from behind the scenes, understanding the hidden world of medieval. Women's education reveals not only the constraints they faced, but also their resilience and creativity. Education by birth and status education in the medieval era was not universal. For most people, including women, formal schooling was rare and reserved for the wealthy or clergy. Noble and aristocratic girls might receive some instruction in reading, writing, music, and etiquette, usually at home, guided by tutors or in convents. For many others, especially peasant women, education was informal and oral, learning skills and wisdom through daily life, stories, and hands-on practice. Convents as centers of learning religious life offered some of the most accessible avenues for female education. Convents and monasteries served as places where women could read Latin texts, learn music and chant, and copy manuscripts. Abbesses and nuns sometimes became respected scholars, theologians, and writers. The cloistered life, while restrictive in many ways, allowed certain women to develop intellectual skills denied to others. Literacy among laywomen outside. Religious settings. Literacy among women was scarce, but not non-existent. Some merchants' wives, artisans, or midwives learned to read and write for business or personal needs. Letters, account books, and legal documents sometimes bear the handwriting or signatures of women. Such literacy, however limited, allowed women to negotiate contracts, manage property, and maintain correspondence. Forms of learning. Women's education often focused on practical skills, household management, child rearing, needlework, and herbal remedies. Religious instruction was central, learning prayers, hymns, and moral teachings. Storytelling, proverbs, and oral poetry conveyed cultural knowledge and values. These non-written forms of education were vital to daily survival and cultural continuity. Barriers to education numerous. Social and institutional barriers hindered women's learning. Prevailing beliefs held that women were intellectually inferior, or that too much learning would lead to moral corruption. Formal schools rarely admitted girls, and universities excluded women entirely. Economic necessity often forced girls into labor early, limiting time for study. Women, writers and patrons, despite obstacles. Some women became authors and patrons of learning. Figures like Christine de Pizan wrote influential works defending women's intellect. Noble women sponsored artists and scribes, fostering cultural production. Their contributions often went unrecognized, but had lasting impact. Education as resistance. For some women, education was a form of subtle resistance against social norms. Learning to read and write enabled them to assert legal rights, manage estates, and influence family decisions. Teaching daughters to read or pass down knowledge empowered future generations. Legacy of learning. Medieval women's educational efforts laid foundations for future advances. Their manuscripts, letters, and teachings survived wars and upheavals. They remind us that knowledge is not simply passed down, but actively preserved and reshaped by those often overlooked. Conclusion. Though barred from many formal institutions, medieval women's engagement with education was vital to their survival and influence. Their thirst for learning and preservation of knowledge reveal a dimension of medieval life full of courage and quiet power. In a time when the burdens on medieval women were immense, creativity offered a rare and precious form of expression. Through art and music, women carved spaces where their voices could resonate, not always openly, but often powerfully and enduringly. These creative acts were more than mere pastime. They were lifelines, legacies, and silent forms of resistance against a world that sought to limit women's presence. Exploring the art and music created or inspired by medieval women reveals a vibrant cultural layer woven into the fabric of Abe. A brutal era. Domestic arts, craftsmanship, and creativity for most medieval women. Artistic expression began at home through skilled handiwork, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, and embroidering garments were essential tasks, but they also allowed for intricate creativity. Needlework wasn't merely decorative. It conveyed identity, status, and storytelling. Women embroidered religious scenes, family crests, and symbolic motifs, each stitch a deliberate act of communication. These textiles became treasured heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, preserving cultural memory. Illuminated manuscripts and female patrons. While most manuscript production was male-dominated, women participated as patrons and occasionally as scribes or illustrators. Wealthy noblewomen commissioned illuminated manuscripts, prayer books, and devotional texts. The Book of Hours, a popular devotional book, often included personalized prayers and beautiful illuminations, reflecting the owner's piety and status. Some convents produced manuscripts, with nuns copying texts and illuminating pages, contributing to the preservation of knowledge. Women as musicians and performers. Music was a vital part of medieval life. In churches, courts, and communities, women sang hymns in convents and households, participated in religious ceremonies, and sometimes performed in courts. While professional, female musicians were rare and sometimes frowned upon. Many women learned instruments such as the harp, psaltery, or flute. Songs composed or performed by women often focused on themes of love, faith, and social commentary. The troubadour tradition and female poets in some regions, especially southern France. The troubadour tradition flourished, where poetry and music intertwined. Though mostly male, this tradition included troubarets, female troubadours, who wrote and performed lyrical poetry. Their works expressed female perspectives on love, desire, and societal expectations, providing rare insight into women's emotional lives. Religious music and female chant convents were centers of musical innovation. Nuns sang Gregorian chant and developed unique musical styles. Hildegard of Bingen, a renowned abbess, composed sacred music that remains influential. Music provided spiritual solace and intellectual engagement within the cloistered life. Art as devotion and resistance. Artistic creation was often deeply tied to faith. Women crafted religious icons, sculptures, and altar cloths, channeling devotion through hands and hearts. At the same time, some artistic expressions subtly challenged norms, incorporating personal symbolism or highlighting female saints and virtues. The limits and challenges. Women's artistic activities were constrained by social expectations and limited resources. Many works went uncredited or were attributed to male relatives. Economic hardships restricted access to materials and formal training. Legacy of medieval women's creativity. Despite obstacles, medieval women's artistic and musical contributions shaped cultural heritage. Their works influenced religious practice, courtly life, and folk traditions. Modern scholarship increasingly uncovers and celebrates these voices. Conclusion: in a brutal world, art and music offered medieval women a voice beyond words, a way to endure, communicate, and leave a lasting mark. Their creative legacy invites us to hear the melodies and see the colors that brighten even the darkest times dot in the dimly lit chambers of medieval Europe, where rigid social rules sought to confine women's bodies and voices. There existed a different kind of power, one born from spiritual vision and inner revelation. Medieval women mystics and visionaries forged a path beyond earthly restrictions, shaping religious thought and inspiring generations, all while walking a narrow line between veneration and suspicion. Not to grasp the full spectrum of medieval womanhood, we must enter the realm of female spirituality, a world where faith, suffering, and transcendence intertwined, and where women's voices echoed most clearly. The context of female spirituality, medieval Christianity, permeated every aspect of life, setting a framework that both constrained and enabled women. The Church upheld strict gender hierarchies, but also offered women access to spiritual roles unavailable elsewhere. Within convents, women devoted themselves to prayer and contemplation, yet the desire for direct experience of God, the mystical union, led some women beyond cloister walls into wider religious influence. Famous medieval women mystics. Several remarkable women became known for their mystical experiences and writings. Julian of Norwich, 1342 c. 1416. A recluse and anchoress in England, Julian experienced intense visions during a severe illness. Her work, Revelations of Divine Love, is one of the earliest known English-language spiritual texts written by a woman. She offered a hopeful theology centered on God's love and compassion, challenging darker views of divine judgment. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179. A German abbess and polymath, Hildegard was a composer, writer, and mystic. Her visions inspired theological works and liturgical music. She advocated for reform and expressed views on nature, medicine, and the cosmos, blending spirituality with early science. Catherine of Siena, 1347 to 1380. Known for her intense devotional life and political influence, Catherine worked to heal divisions within the church and society. She wrote letters to popes and rulers, and was later declared a doctor of the church. Mysticism as empowerment. Mystical experiences allowed women to claim spiritual authority in a male-dominated church. Visions and revelations were regarded as divine gifts, granting women a voice beyond human institutions. Mystics often counseled clergy and laity alike, shaping religious practices. Their writings remain foundational in Christian spirituality. Challenges and suspicion. Female mystics walked a precarious path. Claims of visions could provoke skepticism, jealousy, or accusations of heresy. The line between saint and heretic was thin, especially for women who stepped outside prescribed roles. Some mystics faced interrogation or suppression. Spirituality and suffering. Many mystics framed suffering as a path to divine union. Physical pain, illness, and social marginalization were interpreted as participation in Christ's suffering. This theology offered meaning to hardship but also demanded endurance. Lay women's devotions. Beyond famous mystics, countless women practiced personal spirituality, prayers, pilgrimages, and rituals. Women's religious guilds and confraternities created communal devotional spaces. Pilgrimage sites like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela attracted female pilgrims seeking healing and grace. Female saints and their cult's veneration of female saints like Saint Margaret, Saint Barbara, and Saint Agnes provided models of virtue and strength. Relics and shrines became focal points for women's spiritual life. Stories of saints' miracles offered hope and reinforced social ideals. The intersection of spirituality and daily life. Faith shaped how women understood their roles as wives, mothers, and community members. Religious festivals, fasts, and observances marked the rhythm of life. The church provided rituals for birth, marriage, and death, embedding spirituality deeply into existence. Mysticism's legacy. Medieval women mystics influenced later spiritual movements, literature, and theology. Their writings inspired Renaissance and modern thinkers, including feminist theologians. They expanded the boundaries of female, spiritual expression. Conclusion. In an era often defined by hardship and control, medieval women's spirituality reveals a realm of inner freedom and profound influence. Through visions, writings, and devotions, these women claimed a sacred voice, challenging, comforting, and transforming the religious landscape. In the vast canvas of medieval life, marked by hardship, strict social rules, and constant labor, it might seem as if joy was scarce or even forbidden for women. Yet, even in the darkest of times, medieval women found moments of light, small joys, rituals, and leisure activities that nurtured their spirits, strengthened community bonds, and created pockets of happiness amid struggle. To understand the full humanity of medieval women, it's essential to explore these moments where life, however brutal overall, flickered with warmth and connection. Daily rhythms and simple pleasures. Medieval days were long and filled with work, but women often found brief pauses to savor simple pleasures, sharing a meal with family, tasting fresh bread, or enjoying a rare moment of rest provided comfort. Even mundane tasks like spinning or weaving could be accompanied by song, storytelling, or companionship, transforming work into a social activity. Festivals and celebrations. Religious festivals punctuated the year with communal joy. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days were occasions for feasting, music, dancing, and gift-giving. Women played central roles in preparing for these events, baking special foods, decorating homes, and organizing gatherings. These celebrations offered temporary escape from daily toil and reinforced social ties. Courtship and marriage rituals. Though marriages were often arranged, courtship rituals existed and provided excitement and hope. Songs, poetry, and dances allowed women to express affection and engage socially. Public celebrations around weddings brought communities together, offering joy and entertainment. Music and dance music was integral to social life. Women sang in households, at markets, and during work. Dancing, sometimes in circles or lines, was a favorite communal pastime during festivals and fairs. These activities created moments of freedom and expression within rigid social frameworks. Storytelling and oral traditions. Storytelling was a cherished leisure activity. Women shared folktales, legends, and family histories around fires or during gatherings. These narratives preserved culture, entertained, and taught moral lessons. They also allowed women to voice hopes, fears, and wisdom creatively. Gardening and nature. Some women tended small gardens, growing herbs, vegetables, and flowers. Gardening connected them to the earth, offered practical benefits, and provided aesthetic pleasure. The natural world inspired poetry and spiritual reflection. Friendship and social visits. Visiting neighbors, sharing tea or ale, and informal gatherings were vital for emotional support and socialization. These interactions created networks of care and companionship essential for survival. Craft and artistic expression. Needlework, embroidery, and crafting were both work and creative outlets. Women took pride in their handiwork, often gifting embroidered items that expressed affection and status. Reading and writing. Among literate women, reading devotional texts or poetry was a treasured pastime. Writing letters allowed personal connection and intellectual engagement. Motherhood and childcare. Despite hardships, moments of affection and play with children brought joy. Breastfeeding, Lullabies and storytelling created bonds and nurtured hope. Conclusion: medieval women's leisure and everyday joys, though constrained, were vital acts of resilience. These moments of light sustained them through brutality and helped weave the social and cultural fabric of their communities. Though medieval women lived under crushing constraints, their impact rippled far beyond their immediate circumstances, shaping the cultural, social, and spiritual landscapes of Europe in ways that continue to influence us today. To appreciate their full legacy, we must trace the subtle yet powerful threads they wove into history's fabric. Threads of resilience, creativity, community, and transformation. Women, as cultural keepers, medieval women preserved traditions through oral history, domestic arts, and religious practices. By passing down songs, recipes, stories, and rituals, they maintained community identity and continuity. Their roles as storytellers and caregivers ensured cultural knowledge survived wars, plagues, and social upheaval. Economic foundations: women's labor in homes, farms, markets, and crafts underpinned medieval economies. Even when unrecognized, their work sustained families and communities. This economic foundation laid groundwork for later social and economic changes that shifted gender roles. Religious and spiritual legacy: female mystics, nuns, and saints influenced theology, devotional practices, and spiritual life. Their writings and visions enriched Christian traditions and inspired later religious reforms and feminist theological thought. Legal and social change: women's navigation of medieval laws and customs contributed to evolving legal frameworks. Widows' property rights, petitions, and participation in legal disputes challenged and gradually reshaped gender norms. Artistic and intellectual contributions: women's art, music, and literature, though often anonymous or suppressed, advanced cultural development. Their creativity influenced artistic styles, literary themes, and music traditions. Seeds of feminist thought: early feminist writings and challenges to patriarchal systems trace roots to medieval debates about women's roles and worth. These early voices inspired later movements for gender equality. Legacy in modern consciousness: medieval women's stories inspire contemporary scholarship, literature, art, and activism. Recognizing their struggles and achievements enriches our understanding of gender, power, and history. The ongoing journey: though centuries have passed, the echoes of medieval women's resilience and resistance remind us that progress is built on countless lives of courage and endurance. Their stories urge us to honor hidden histories and continue the work of justice and equality. The medieval world was vast, stretching across continents and seas, filled with countless cultures, languages, and customs. Yet, too often, when we think of medieval women, we picture a narrow slice of experience: an English peasant, a French noblewoman, or a cloistered nun. But the truth is far richer and more complex. Medieval womanhood was not a single story, but a mosaic of lives shaped by geography, class, faith, and politics. To truly grasp why life was brutal for so many women, we must journey beyond familiar borders, discovering untold stories and diverse realities that challenge simple narratives. Noble women of southern Europe: power and patronage in the sunlit courts of Italy, Spain, and southern France. Noble women navigated a different social and cultural world than their northern counterparts. Take Isabella I of Castile, who ruled jointly with her husband Ferdinand and profoundly shaped Spanish history through political alliances, religious policies, and supportive exploration. Women of high birth in these regions often received extensive education in languages, literature, philosophy, and the arts, sometimes surpassing the formal schooling available in Northern Europe. They acted as patrons of architecture, music, and literature, commissioning works that shaped Renaissance culture. Yet, Even these powerful women faced the restrictions of marriage, politics, and expectations of producing heirs. Their power was often exercised behind the scenes, through influence rather than overt rule. Peasant women in the British Isles, labor and lore further north. Peasant women in England, Scotland, and Ireland lived lives dominated by hard, physical labor but enriched with strong community ties and cultural traditions. Their days revolved around the demands of the land, planting, harvesting, animal care, and household chores. Though harsh, their work was interwoven with seasonal rituals and communal gatherings in Gaelic cultures. Women preserved oral traditions, songs, myths, and histories that sustained identity through generations. Their knowledge of herbal remedies and folk medicine was critical to community survival. Byzantine women, spirituality, and imperial influence in the Eastern Byzantine Empire. Women's lives unfolded within a framework of Orthodox Christianity and imperial culture. Elite women, such as Empress Theodora, wielded political influence and were patrons of art and religious institutions. Convents provided places of education and spiritual leadership for many women. Theodora's life, rising from humble origins to empress, demonstrates the potential for social mobility, but also the precariousness of power. Byzantine women balanced roles as mothers, religious devotees, and sometimes political actors within a highly stratified society. Medieval Jewish women, faith and family amid challenged Jewish women across Europe and the Mediterranean lived within tight-knit communities, governed by religious law and social tradition. Their lives were shaped by faith, family, and often external pressures from surrounding Christian or Muslim societies. Some Jewish women became merchants and scholars, managing businesses and engaging in intellectual life. Despite constraints, they preserved cultural and religious traditions that remain vital today. Jewish women also played key roles in transmitting language, customs, and spirituality through domestic education. Women in the medieval Islamic world, education and influence in medieval Islamic societies spanning the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Spain and India. Women's experiences varied widely. Religious teachings granted women rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance, sometimes more generous than in Christian Europe. Women like Fatima al-Fihri, founder of the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco, left enduring educational legacies. Elite women engaged in patronage of architecture, literature, and the arts. Yet social customs, such as veiling and seclusion, shaped public life for many women, varying across regions and classes. Trade, travel, and cultural exchange, medieval trade routes, and the Crusades facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and people, influencing women's lives across regions. Merchant women traveled, managed businesses, and engaged in economic networks stretching from Europe to Asia. Cultural exchanges brought new fashions, technologies, and religious ideas, altering gender roles subtly. Women often acted as cultural mediators within families and communities, preserving traditions while adapting to change, challenging Eurocentric narratives, expanding our view beyond Western Europe, enriches the story of medieval women and challenges narrow historical perspectives. Recognizing diverse experiences reveals how intersectional factors, race, class, religion, geography, shaped women's lives. This broader understanding counters stereotypes and honors the complexity of history. Recovering lost voices. Many medieval women's stories have been lost or silenced by history's biases. Modern historians, archaeologists, and scholars work to recover these voices through texts, artifacts, and oral traditions. These efforts illuminate women's roles in law, economy, culture, and spirituality that were long ignored. The rediscovery of women's histories reshapes how we view the medieval world and its legacies. Conclusion. A mosaic of lives. Medieval womanhood was not a single narrative, but a rich mosaic of lives, struggles, and triumphs dot from noble courts to village hearths, from convents to marketplaces. Women shaped and were shaped by their worlds. Their diverse experiences reveal both the brutal realities they endured and the resilience they displayed dot as we continue. This journey, we will explore how these varied experiences influenced legal frameworks, family dynamics, and cultural traditions, uncovering how women navigated and transformed the medieval landscape. When we think about medieval women's lives, it's easy to imagine a uniform set of harsh conditions imposed by a monolithic society. But the medieval world was vast and varied, a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, city-states, and rural communities, each with its own customs, laws, and traditions. For women, this meant that their daily realities were shaped not only by the universal hardships of their time, but also by the specific legal frameworks governing their regions. Understanding these regional legal differences reveals how medieval womanhood was experienced in profoundly different ways, sometimes opening small spaces of autonomy, sometimes tightening the grip of control. The legal landscape of medieval Europe. A complex mosaic. Medieval Europe was not governed by a single legal code, but by a multiplicity of laws. Royal statutes, customary laws, feudal obligations, canon, law from the church, and local traditions. Women's rights, duties, and protections varied dramatically depending on where they lived. The legal status of women was shaped by these intersecting systems, resulting in a complex reality where geography could be a matter of survival. The role of religion in family and community. Religion infused family and communal life. Religious rites marked life stages, baptism, marriage, funerals, reinforcing social bonds. Church teachings shaped gender roles and expectations, often emphasizing women's submission, but also compassion and charity. Case studies. Family dynamics and women's agency. Historical records show women negotiating family disputes, managing dowries, and influencing household decisions. Some women used familial alliances to protect themselves or advance their interests. Others faced conflict, abandonment, or violence within families. The impact of social change on family and community. Economic shifts, urbanization, and political upheavals altered family structures and community life. Nuclear families became more common in some regions. Women's participation in urban economies changed traditional roles. Yet, core social bonds remained vital. Conclusion. Family and community as both shelter and cage for medieval women. Family and community were essential for survival, but also sources of constraint. Navigating these networks required skill, resilience, and sometimes sacrifice. Understanding these social ties is key to comprehending the brutal realities and enduring strengths of medieval womanhood. Medieval Europe was a world of growing towns, bustling markets, and expanding trade routes. Though often overlooked by traditional history, women were indispensable players in this economic transformation. From weaving cloth in cottages to managing shops in city streets, from tending fields to running businesses, medieval women contributed crucial labor and skill to local and regional economies. Yet, despite their vital work, women faced legal, social, and economic barriers that constrained their opportunities and rights. Exploring women's roles in economy and trade reveals not only their contributions, but also the structural challenges that made life brutal for many. The agricultural economy. Women's labor on the land. Most medieval Europeans lived in rural areas, dependent on agriculture. Women's labor on farms was essential for household survival and market production. Their tasks included planting and harvesting crops, tending gardens, caring for animals, and processing food. During busy seasons, the entire family worked the land, with women performing physically demanding labor. Household production. Textiles and craftsmanship. Textile production was one of the most important industries involving women. Spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving cloth on looms, and sewing garments were typically women's work. These textiles supplied families and markets, and supported trades such as tailoring and drapery. Skill and speed in textile production influenced household wealth and status. Markets and merchant activities. Women often took goods to local markets to sell. Foodstuffs, textiles, crafts, or other products. Market days were central to rural and urban economies and served as social hubs. Merchant women, especially widows, sometimes managed shops or stalls. In some towns, women organized themselves into guilds or informal associations to protect their economic interests. Guilds and women's participation guilds regulated trades, maintained quality, and protected members' interests. While many guilds excluded women formally, widows could often inherit their husbands' memberships and continue businesses. Some guilds had separate female branches or allowed women limited participation. Women's guilds also existed independently, focusing on specific trades like brewing or sewing. Brewing and food production. Brewing ale was a common and respected female occupation. Women known as brewsters or alewives produced ale for local consumption and sale. Brewing was both a household necessity and a commercial venture. Women also engaged in baking, dairy production, and preserving foods. Urban trades and workshops. In towns and cities, women worked as artisans, shopkeepers, and service providers. Some were tailors, embroiderers, midwives, or healers. Widows especially could run workshops and trade independently. City laws sometimes protected women's economic rights, but also imposed restrictions. Money lending and financial roles. Women occasionally acted as moneylenders or financiers, particularly among merchant classes. Their financial activities could support trade, ventures, or household economies. However, such roles required careful negotiation of social norms and legal frameworks. Challenges and legal barriers. Women's economic activities were constrained by laws limiting property ownership, contractual rights, and public presence. Social attitudes often viewed women's work as secondary or subordinate to men's. Economic independence could provoke suspicion or conflict within families and communities. Economic agency and resistance. Despite barriers, women exercised economic agency through negotiation, patronage, and collective action. Women could petition courts, form partnerships, and engage in informal economies. Their participation challenged assumptions about gender and labor. Case studies of women entrepreneurs. Historical records show women running successful businesses. From textile production to trade, some women gained wealth and influence, sometimes rivaling male counterparts. Their stories illustrate both opportunity and struggle. The impact of economic roles on daily life. Women's work shaped family dynamics, social status, and personal identity. Economic participation influenced marriage prospects, community standing, and survival. Work was often a balancing act with domestic and caregiving responsibilities. Economic change and women's future. Economic transformations laid foundations for gradual changes in women's social roles. Growing towns, expanding markets, and shifts in labor created new possibilities. Yet, progress was uneven and contested. Conclusion: women's work as foundation and frontier. Medieval women's labor was the foundation of economies, but also a frontier for asserting rights and agency. Their contributions sustained communities and influenced social change. Understanding women's economic roles is essential to recognizing the complexity of medieval womanhood. In medieval society, property and economic control were sources of power, security, and survival. for women especially. In a patriarchal world, gaining and maintaining control over property was both a vital necessity and a formidable challenge. Throughout the Middle Ages, women engaged in continuous legal battles and social negotiations to assert their rights, protect their families, and carve out spaces of autonomy within often hostile legal frameworks. This chapter explores the complexity of these struggles, revealing a world where medieval women were far from passive victims, but active agents navigating, resisting, and reshaping their social worlds. The importance of property for medieval women ownership and control of property were more than economic issues. Property symbolized status, security, and social identity. For married women, property rights were limited by coverture, which placed legal control in husbands' hands. Widows and unmarried women, however, could hold and manage property, sometimes acting as economic actors in their own right. Marriage contracts and dowries. Marriage contracts formalized economic arrangements between families. Dowries, the property a woman brought to marriage, were crucial for negotiating status and wealth. Contracts could specify rights to property during marriage, widowhood, or in the case of annulment. Women's legal struggles often began here, ensuring dowry protections and inheritance rights. Widowhood as a legal turning point. Widowhood presented unique legal opportunities and challenges. Widows could inherit dower rights, a life interest in a portion of their late husband's estate, granting financial independence. They often managed estates, oversaw tenants, and conducted business. However, widows faced pressures to remarry or relinquish property, and their rights varied by region and social status. Legal courts and women's access to justice. Medieval legal systems included royal, manorial, ecclesiastical, and local courts. Women's access to courts was limited by social and legal norms, but not absent. Some women petitioned courts to claim property, defend dowries, or seek protection from abuse. Court records reveal women arguing over land, debts, contracts, and custody. Petitions and advocacy. Women used petitions as a formal means of seeking redress or asserting claims. Petitions to kings, lords, or church officials could secure rights or settle disputes. These documents provide insight into women's agency and legal strategies. Negotiation within families' property disputes often involved family negotiation and mediation. Women leveraged kinship ties, alliances, and social status to influence outcomes. Elders, husbands, brothers, or sons could support or oppose women's claims. Social pressure and informal resolutions. Beyond formal law, community norms shaped property relations. Informal settlements, negotiations, or social sanctions influenced women's ability to control assets. Gossip, reputation, and church authority played roles in enforcing or challenging property rights. Examples from legal records. Detailed court cases highlight women's struggles. A widow suing to reclaim her dower. A daughter contesting inheritance with brothers. A merchant's wife managing debts and contracts. These cases illustrate women's determination and legal acumen. Challenges of enforcement. Even when laws favored women, enforcement was often difficult. Male relatives or local officials might resist or obstruct women's claims. Violence, intimidation, or economic pressure were common tactics to deny women property. The role of the church in property disputes. Church courts addressed marriage, inheritance, and moral issues. Canon law sometimes supported women's claims, especially regarding dowries and marriage annulments. Religious figures could mediate disputes or provide sanctuary. Education and legal literacy. Some women acquired legal knowledge, often through family or religious instruction. Literacy enabled women to understand contracts, write petitions, or negotiate. Educated women were better equipped to defend their rights. The economic impact of property. Control property ownership affected women's social standing, marriage prospects, and family influence. Control over land or wealth allowed some women to act as patrons, support relatives, or engage in commerce. Economic autonomy was linked to broader social power. Resistance to legal change. Patriarchal structures resisted women's economic empowerment. Legal reforms favoring women were often limited or repealed. Social attitudes upheld male dominance over property. The long-term legacy women's legal struggles contributed to gradual evolution of property rights. Their persistence influenced later legal developments and feminist movements. Conclusion: the battle over property and economic rights was central to medieval women's lives. Legal and social negotiations reveal a complex interplay of power, resistance, and survival. Recognizing these struggles deepens our understanding of medieval womanhood beyond victimhood, highlighting agency within constraint. As the centuries of medieval hardship unfolded, religion was both a sanctuary and a crucible for women. Faith shaped their daily existence, offering meaning, hope, and community in a world often marked by brutality. Yet, it also reinforced the social hierarchies and gender roles that constrained women's freedoms and amplified their vulnerabilities. In this final part of our journey through medieval womanhood, we explore how religious life intertwined with social and legal realities, and we reflect on the enduring legacy of these women, whose lives of endurance, courage, and quiet rebellion continue to inspire. The central role of religion in medieval life. Medieval Europe was a deeply religious society. From birth to death, the rhythms of life were marked by Christian sacraments, prayers, and festivals. For women, religion offered a framework to understand suffering, morality, and purpose. Provided community through parish life, guilds, and convents. Church teachings shaped ideas about femininity, family, and social order. Women in the church. Devotion and constraint. Most women engaged with the church as lay members, attending Mass and observing fasts. But religious life also offered paths beyond marriage and motherhood. Women could become nuns, dedicating their lives to prayer, learning, and service. Within convents, some women gained education, leadership roles, and spiritual authority rare in secular society. Abbesses managed estates, corresponded with powerful figures, and shaped religious practice. The spiritual power of mystics and visionaries. Some women transcended their social limitations through mysticism. Mystics like Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena claimed visions and divine revelations. Their writings offered radical insights into God's love and human dignity. These spiritual leaders challenged church authorities, advocated for reform, and inspired lay followers. The church's role in social control, while offering spiritual refuge, the church also upheld patriarchal norms. Clerical teachings emphasized women's obedience and chastity. Church courts enforced moral behavior, punishing transgressions with penance or worse. Women accused of witchcraft or heresy faced harsh trials. Religious festivals and community life. Religious holidays punctuated the year with celebration. Women played central roles in preparing feasts, organizing processions, and caring for the poor. These communal rituals strengthened social bonds and provided relief from daily hardship. Marriage and the sacrament of holy union. The church sanctified marriage, emphasizing its indissolubility. This spiritual framing reinforced women's subordinate role within the family. Yet, marriage was also a source of companionship, love, and social stability for many women. Women's religious patronage. Wealthy women acted as patrons of churches, monasteries, and religious art. These acts of patronage secured spiritual benefits and social prestige. Women's donations and endowments supported religious communities and cultural production. Religion as a source of resilience for many medieval women. Faith provided comfort and strength. Prayer, pilgrimage, and contemplation offered meaning amid suffering. Religious narratives affirmed women's value beyond earthly roles. The lasting legacy of medieval women's faith, women's spiritual lives, influenced Christian theology, devotional practices, and community life. Their contributions to religious art, music, and literature endure. Modern scholars and faith communities continue to draw inspiration from their stories. Final reflections. Endurance, agency, and memory. The brutal realities of medieval womanhood, from physical toil and legal constraint to social control and violence, paint a portrait of hardship. Yet, amid these challenges, women carved out spaces of agency, creativity, and resilience. They nurtured families, shaped economies, preserved culture, and inspired faith. Their stories remind us that history is complex, layered, and filled with voices long silenced. Why remember medieval women today? Reflecting on medieval women's lives challenges modern assumptions about gender, power, and progress. Their endurance under brutality is a testament to human strength. Their quiet rebellions invite us to recognize agency even in constrained circumstances. Remembering their histories enriches contemporary struggles for equality and justice. The continuum of womanhood. Medieval women's experiences are not relics of the past, but links in a continuum. Their lives connect to those who followed, influencing evolving roles, rights, and identities. Understanding their stories deepens our appreciation of women's ongoing journeys. A call to honor and learn as we conclude this series. Let us honor the countless medieval women whose lives shaped the world. May their resilience inspire empathy, scholarship, and action. Their stories invite us to listen closely to the past, to build a more just future. This concludes our in-depth exploration of why life was brutal for medieval women, a journey through hardship and hope, oppression and endurance, silence and strength. Thank you for traveling this path with me. Good night.